Hello, you're listening to Don't Listen to This podcast, all about 1,001 albums to listen to before you die, or allegedly should. I'm your host, Ewan Gleadow, still deaf in one ear, but we'll struggle on through manfully as I bring on guest after guest to talk to me about all of their favourite or least favourite albums. I'm sure it'll be the former category this time because I have brought on the wonderful Graham Williamson of Pop Screen and Geek Show fame. Would you like to introduce yourself, get the plug in early, get your socials in there? We can switch it round this episode. We'll do it at the start rather than the end.
Of course, yeah, do it before people have a chance to turn off. Yes, you can find me on Letterboxd, just search for Graham Williamson. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Graham W Films. And yeah, as Ewan said, you can hear me at thegeekshow.co.uk doing their Pop Screen podcast, which Ewan has been on several episodes of.
I have. I've struggled through to talk about all things music on there as well as here now. What have you been listening to recently? What's been on your old iPhone music box, record player, MP3 player? I believe people still use the little ones for planes.
God, yeah, they're probably due a cassette-style comeback now, aren't they? Yeah.
If only. Artists start releasing little MP3s that only have their song on them.
Well, I'm sure anyone who knows me won't fall off their chair when I say I've been listening to a lot of David Bowie recently. It's just me.
There's nothing
Yeah,
better though, to be fair.
to be fair, yes.
I've got a
I
favourites
was
playlist. Yeah.
listening to Scary Monsters and Super Creeps for the first time in ages today. People forget how heavy an album that is.
Yeah.
It's really riffy and noisy in a way that, like, just knowing Ashes to Ashes can't really prepare you for.
Yeah. Ashes to Ashes always used to freak me out as a kid. What was the
It's got scary video.
It
I
does,
think
it's
the
freaky.
video is quite creepy.
I think I'll have seen it not on MTV, but on like now that's what I call music, 1970s, 80s. I don't know why it was on there. It was wedged in between Elvis Costello's Watching the Detectives and maybe Rio by Duran Duran. But
That's interesting. Yeah, yeah.
honestly,
I also like to keep up with a lot of new releases because I like to make end of year mixtapes for friends. So
nice.
I've had a few things I haven't got round to yet. I'm still need to get to grips with the new Sorry album. I need to give the new Steve Lacy one a couple of goes. Obsessed with Mahal by R.E.M, which is one of those records where you just think, if I was good at what I do, I would have made that album. If I was that talented, because every sound on it is just so me. It's just the ability to put them together that well that I'm lacking in. But it's a great record.
I might have another recommendation for you, actually. I don't want to drift too far away from R.E.M, but Charlotte Dos Santos. It's like a neo-funk R&B soul album. And it comes out in a couple of days from when we're recording it, but by the time this episode's out, it'll been out for decades, I imagine. It's a second album, but she's got another one called Cleo, and that's just such a perfect taste test of her music. It's unbelievably, really, really well worked, really great lyrics. Just overall, really solid. And speaking of solid, we've got R.E.M. to do. We've got Murmur, their first ever album. So just before we can delve into conversation, really, I have to read out the mandatory entry of the book.
Please
that's
do.
The whole point. We're discussing the book. We're discussing the albums in the book, and I didn't write it down on my notes this time, so I've got it on my phone. Because about 5 minutes before we started this recording, I thought, you know what, I fancy a coffee. Made a coffee and then looked at my notes and thought, you know what, I've not finished these. So, before we begin, Murmur, 1983, R.E.M, Michael Stipe, Peter Buck, Mike Mills, and Bill Berry. The genres for this album, allegedly, are jangle pop, alternative rock, and post-punk. And Mills is the only member of the band who have had any formal music training. And I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit because it does show. But the insert reads, if I can read it, because it's one of those pages that curves in to the middle of the page. Dylan Thomas once joked that his early poems were so complex he no longer understood them himself. Michael Stipe was also to confess 3 years after writing Murmur's anthemic Pilgrimage that it still baffles me. Thus, the band's debut, characterised by his hazy mutterings, is aptly titled. But Stipe never aspired to classical poetics. He recognised that implication and cryptic imagery could suggest an awful lot. In truth, early R.E.M. needed Stipe's mystic warblings to stand them apart. Musically, Murmur swerves around Peter Buck's jangly Rickenbacker chords and Stipe's nagging melodies. Having formed amid the alternative bands of Athens, Georgia, R.E.M. won a following on the college gig and radio circuit. Murmur was created in a Carolina gospel studio with their label demanding the producers deliver a hit. A classical cellist played on Talk About the Passion and was baffled at having no sheet music to work from. Murmur was a critical sensation. Rolling Stone named it Album of the Year, and the LP crept into the US Top 30. The band's hefty grassroots following was a factor, and R.E.M. offered homegrown talent with a subtler sound than, say, Husker Du or Green on Red. Even the gothic cover photo takes a rootsy approach, portraying the creepy kudzu vine that proliferates in Georgia and a rural Athens railway trestle. The New York Times review claimed Murmur would sound as fresh 10 years from now as it does today, make that 20 years or even 30. Now, we are 39 years on from Murmur, if my maths
We
is
are,
correct.
yes.
Do you think it still sounds as fresh as it did back then than it does
I
now?
think it does, yeah, and I think part of that is because it has its own kind of mystery, not just to Stipe's lyrics, which I'm sure we'll get onto because they are extraordinarily hard
Yeah.
to understand. That is not a lie. Um, but the whole atmosphere, all of the reference points of the record are taking place in a different universe, not just to other 80s records, but it's hard to really think back to like the last folk revival in American music was that sort of old weird America scene fueled by artists like the Band or the Byrds, both of whom this was compared to when it came out. But I don't think it sounds that much like them either, to be honest.
No, you're absolutely right. It's very different, and I suppose that when I first listened to it, so I suppose I better ask before we delve into big
Mm,
topics. What are your memories with this album? Because for me, it was associating any album with Jangle Pop immediately brings up an inference to the Smiths, and
yeah.
I was worried that when I first listened to Murmur all those years ago, that it would be something that was like the Smiths. I mean, at the time,
Mm,
I was a huge Smiths fan. I think everybody has a phase where they enjoy the Smiths and they buy Meat Is Murder on vinyl, which I did.
yeah.
But when you hear jangle pop out as a genre, you always think, oh well, where's Morrissey's influence on this? Where's that going to come in? And it doesn't.
Yeah.
Thankfully, R.E.M's Murmur is very unique in that experience, and it was one of the first albums I ever listened to when I actually first started the 1001 Albums book about 3 years ago. Um, not because it was like the first one in the book, because I knew of R.E.M before that. I think I'd just watched Man on the
Yeah.
Moon, and about a decade before that, it was Losing My Religion was one of the songs on Guitar Hero Warriors of Rock, which I don't know why. That was my introduction.
Mandolin Hero.
That was my introduction to REM. Was playing it as Lars Ulrich on Guitar Hero Warriors of Rock, dressed as a mummy, and I remember thinking, well, this is quite good. I should probably explore this. And then I found Man on the Moon, and then Automatic for the People, and then you progress from there. I wish I'd had a more interesting innovation and an introduction to REM, but no, Guitar Hero at my mate's house was where I found it.
Well, for me, R.E.M. One of the only bands who've been sort of a constant for my whole music listening life. I think when I was a kid, I don't know if it was the first single I bought, but it was definitely one of the first singles I bought was Shiny Happy People, and I will always be a vociferous defender of that song, often against the band themselves. Um, but then I took a couple of years out of music when I was a kid. I took a couple of years out of like obsessively listening to the charts because it got into grunge and metal. And although I do like grunge now, it's kind of heavy for when you're 7 years old. It's not really ideal music for
I
that.
was listening to
But
McFly when I was 7.
yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, some heavy music works, but but the thing is, when I came back, it was for the Britpop years, and in between, there had been an almost total wipeout of every act I remember being in the charts back then. A lot of the heavy rock acts had had their careers ended by Nevermind. A lot of the dance acts who I remembered were just fly by nights who released one or two singles, then vanished. The only constants I found were Blur, because I remembered There's No Other Way being a hit, when I was first into music, and R.E.M, who were still around. And I was so beguiled at the fact that R.E.M was still around and still producing such like unique and individual music that for the first time in my life, I did a proper back catalogue deep dive. I went out, I found every old R.E.M album I could. And so Murmur was kind of an album I knew about before I had heard it. I had been into R.E.M fandom enough to know that this was the most mysterious one. This was them at their most insular before they even made the like baby steps towards commercial sounds that you can hear on a record like Reckoning or Life's Rich Pageant.
Absolutely, yeah. It was my first deep dive as well. I remember
Mm,
almost finishing it. I listened from everywhere to Murmur up to Monster, and then I just stopped because I had to
yeah.
move out for uni. And I thought, well, I'll get back to it in a moment. And that was 3 years ago. And yesterday was the first time I listened to New Adventures in Hi-Fi. So it took me a bit of time to finish it off, and I've still got Up, Reveal, and the rest of them. But
Yeah.
that was what spawned my sort of obsession with music, and it's strange because REM are not like my favorite band. REM are brilliant, and
Mm,
it's a band that one of the few where me and my parents are kind of like, yeah, we like these, put them on. Um, it's a very generational band, I think, and I think that's the appeal of
yeah.
it for me is that REM are still very very good. Um, and Murmur is probably a great example of that, especially considering where the band ended up and where they went with their musical style. It's amazing that Murmur stands so firm as, like you said, it's a very mysterious album. It's very cryptic. It's very unassured, and
Yeah.
it's how much of that do you think is down to Michael Stipe not knowing what he's talking about?
It's a fair bit, but also like the prehistory of REM is very interesting, and I'm indebted in here to Marcus Gray's book "It Crawled from the South," which I think is one of the. It's sort of fallen from view a bit recently, but it's one of the great music books in my opinion because it's less a biography and more of an attempt to prod R.E.M's music from every angle and try and work out, why this matters in such a variety of different ways. But back when they were on the like Athens, Georgia student party circuit before they'd recorded anything, they were noted for being kind of the unpretentious good time band of that scene. All of the other Athens bands were interested in doing weird, abstruse, arty stuff. And they would just come on stage and like batter through Louie Louie, and everyone would have a great time. And you sort of think, oh, that's interesting because how on earth do you go from that reputation to making something so insular and spooky, and it's not a difficult album despite all this. I always find Murmur slips down really easy, but I think if you prize a certain kind of clarity, not just in lyrics but in the sound, if you like to pick out individual instruments, this maybe isn't the album for you.
Yeah, definitely. It's very layered, but at the same time, it's like you said, it does go down easily considering how in the hands of another band this would be really heavy going. This is a really
Yeah,
strange and abstract record, and a lot of it comes down to the technical merit essentially, which is surprising considering all but the bass guitarist had no formal training in music. And
yeah,
the masterful thing about Murmur for me is that the layering of of the instruments, the build up despite Stipe's lyrics, the essentially the collection of items here that don't work together just work, and there is
mm,
no reason for it to work. It's annoying that it does, and it's just so impressive that it does. I mean, I suppose it opens with Radio Free Europe, which is I've never been the biggest fan of Radio Free Europe, but I think it's such a great album opener that it just can't be knocked. I think it's such an incredible statement for the band to make just in those opening moments. It's you consider
yeah,
the longevity of REM and what songs they made in the future. Everybody Hurts, Losing My Religion, the big hitters. Radio Free Europe's always at the edge of that association. It's always at the underbelly of being associated as one of their best songs, and you can see why it's it has a longevity to it that is associated for me with the title more than anything. It's Radio Free Europe. That's where it started. That's where it is. The first track of Murmur, that's where it exploded.
And yeah, and I think that's a good sort of way to look at Stipe's lyrics as well, which is that you're not going to get anything that makes solid sense, but the phrases in it are so evocative. The rare phrases that you can pick out always send your imagination in a certain direction. I mean, for me, it all coalesces in laughing, which is, even though it's not exactly my favorite R.E.M song, but if someone mentions R.E.M, it is always the first song I think of. It has something of what makes them great in like the embryo form to me.
Absolutely. It's for me it was the track before it, Pilgrimage, which
Oh
obviously
yes,
gets a
yeah.
mention in the 1001 Albums book where it's not even Stipe knows what he's going on about. And I think for me, because obviously we've worked in sort of criticism for a while, it's for me
Mm,
it's a matter of projecting our own meaning onto art that has no meaning. And I think it's
yeah.
such a difficult line to walk, because on the one hand you are finding a real emotional connection to a song, you are finding something unique to yourself. On the other hand, it might not even be there. And Stipe, by his own admission, has no idea whether it's there or not. And I think that's the great beauty to R.E.M. It's an admittance of not knowing what the form is. And because of that, we are free to
Mm.
mold the form. And something like Pilgrimage for me is just such an intense song. I can pick out moments in that track where it's like, this is genuinely incredible. This is what the band should always be doing forever. That's it. Just make Pilgrimage for every record. That'll do. Um, but it's again, like you said, Stipe's lyrical um, obsessions, really, even if he doesn't know what he's going on about, are so particular and so smart. I mean, if you take Pilgrimage, for instance, it's speaking in tongues, it's worth a broken lip. Your hate clipped and distant, your luck with pilgrimage, and it's the fuck does that mean? But it doesn't matter. It's great. I think it's.
There's a
Hmm?
there's a wonderful moment on a live album that they released very late on in their career where they played a set for fans at the Dublin Olympia. And as you would expect, it's a fan club set. There's loads of early stuff, loads of obscurities. It's wonderful. But there's a fantastic bit where Stipe has just sang West of the Fields. And afterwards he says, now, according to the internet, the line I sing in the middle eight is, the animals are strange. I try to stick it in. I just want you to know that I never wrote that line. I don't know what it is on the
Yeah.
record, but it's not
I think
that.
REM is such a danger to film critics, to music critics and journalists, because to assert any sort of message or meaning in REM songs is to run the risk of Michael Stipe going
Mm.
on stage and saying, "You have no idea what my music is about." It specifically does not mean this. He's the David Lynch of music, and I don't mean in a Lynchian fashion. I
Yeah.
mean in the fact that if he does an interview, he's going to rip the piss out of you, which makes it so
Yes.
difficult to talk about REM. But I do think that helps its legacy. Essentially, I do think it helps it keep a long,
Mm.
recurring life. Even that, it's been 11 years since they disbanded, nearly 12. Um, but
Mm.
they've lived on through this fascination with their lyrics because they haven't given much away. They've not really allowed for many peeks behind the curtain, apart from that bit where they sold one of their songs to Guitar Hero. But we all make mistakes. Um,
Yes.
and I suppose for me, Murmur is a real example of very cryptic, very atmospheric music. And a lot of that does come from Stipe's lyricism, but a lot of it for me is the sort of instrumentals that surround it. I'm genuinely so impressed by stuff like Moral Kiosk or Catapult, because it's just such a flow. It's such a
Mm.
musical. And I know it sounds silly to call an album musical, but there is a real true sensibility of a musical aspect. This is such a focus in on instrumental pieces. It actually focuses in on what makes an album. There are albums that will
Yeah.
just gloss over and say, "Oh, there's the drums, throw them in." There's a real fixation at times on giving everybody a highlight spot, and it never feels that way. It never feels obvious that people are going to be like, "Well, I'm going to have a guitar solo here, or I'm going to start smashing the drums in this way here."
Mm.
It all comes very natural, and I think it's usually just to give Michael Stipe a break from singing because Any
Yeah,
more
essentially.
would sort of
Yeah.
fry his brain. Bless him.
I think one of the things that helps that feel of cohesiveness is the fact that Peter Buck at the time and for many years afterwards, I think it's still something that he's only just come around to, particularly in his work with Luke Haynes. But back then he was very, very anti-guitar solo. He considered it this absolute sort of self-indulgent, macho technique over feeling attitude. And part of that, as he later admitted, was because he couldn't play one at that point. But it does, I think, codifying that into like a band rule and saying we do not do this really helps set the agenda for the whole rest of the album. It's not just the fact that there isn't this bit that sort of twiddles on for
Yeah,
5 minutes in the middle of the song. It's that they know that if Stipe needs a break, what has to follow from that is the groove of the
yes,
song, not a
that's exactly it.
spotlight on a bit of
Yeah.
the song. It's the whole thing has to persist and keep flowing
I'm glad that he
underneath
was
it.
mired by jealousy against guitar solos because in essence it creates a really strong feeling. Like you said, it's a groove, it's a flow, and I think it was wrong of me to say solo essentially. I meant sort of the collection of the instruments together.
There's a
Stipe
break. There are
breaks, yeah,
breaks
there's a
that I
break but
think,
not a solo because I
yeah,
suppose the usual set, and I'm going to use Queen as an example here because you always think of Queen, and the very next thing is, oh well, what's Brian May's solo on this song? That is a
yeah,
segment of its own. It never feels connected to the rest of the song. It feels as though Freddie Mercury's
yeah,
finished the second chorus. Now they need to tie it all together, and then they'll do a big ooh at the end, and that's the end of the song because Brian May's finished his guitar solo, the mandatory bit. And I suppose from you saying that, I was trying to think what are sort of the good guitar solos that really do make sense for a song. And other than Freebird and Layla, I can't really think of many others. A lot of them do feel like mandatory pieces that the band are expected to utilize. Even stuff,
to take it back to the
yeah,
Smiths for a second, I do love the guitar solo in
oh,
Shoplifters the World Unite, if only because at that stage in the song, you just fall off your chair when that happens. That's the last thing you
it is.
expect to
I
kick in.
suppose that's the thing. If you utilize a solo in a way that, like you've just said there, shocks you to the point of it being completely beyond the pale, absolutely use it. If
Mm,
you've gotten a reputation like Queen does of where's the solo, give us the solo, we want the solo,
yeah,
it's difficult to replicate it in a unique or sort of real way. It's difficult to make it feel natural. And if you're
yeah,
preparing for a solo, and I suppose that's why I like Murmur and sort of the jangle pop antithesis of it is that it it doesn't rely on solos. It embarks on a real musical odyssey with the lyrics are at the core. That's very much the direct angle that Michael Stipe takes. The lyrics are at the core. They're the most important bit, even if they don't make sense. Underneath all that is a real layered
yeah.
structure of, you've got the usual bass guitar and drums. Why did I forget drums? Anyways, those three are at the bottom. They're underneath some great lyrics, but they are also given a time to sort of showcase the abilities, like when Stipe has those breaks. And I
Mm,
think for me that does give Murmur a real sense of balance because if you had just Stipe singing and singing and singing, people are eventually going to go, "What the fuck is he going on about? Please, just take a moment
yes.
to think about what you're saying." And I'm glad they struck that balance because it's a balance they really did rely on in the later records because so again, I like using the example of Losing My Religion because I think that's sort of for me, the most pop exploitive album song they did, if that makes any sense. That's a jumble of words. It was a high charting
I think
track,
it's true. Yeah.
but it had such nonsensical lyrics at times where it could have just slotted on Murmur if they'd written it at that point.
It's funny, isn't it? Because Losing My Religion happened, I think, about sort of 8 or 9 years into their career, and it really does feel like a hit they had on their own terms. For all it's very crisply and cleanly recorded, and Stipe's voice is right at the front rather than mumbling away in the background, but it still has that spirit. There's still something essentially mysterious about it that is not something you can say about most sort of early 90s soft rock radio hits. That's not a mysterious subgenre, I
Absolutely.
think.
It's strange that Stipe got associated with such essentially a normal genre, I guess. It's just a very broad sort of genre. I mean, R.E.M. as a whole, I guess alternative rock is what we can call it. But that's such a
Yeah.
big label. You could fit anything in there. Queen are technically alternative rock, but
Well, it's sort of you can understand a bit of how R.E.M. was seen by looking back through their press cuttings and seeing which band they were compared to. Like at this point, and for most of the rest of the 80s, there was a sense that, oh, this is the American answer to the Smiths. This is this kind of cult jangle pop band with a sort of eccentric lead singer, and that's their niche. And then the Smiths split up, and R.E.M. signed to Warner, and it became R.E.M. are like the thinking man's U2. But of course, U2 exceeded R.E.M. in size in a lot of ways, and I think, you
you
know,
two had the edge.
YouTube had the edge, yes. But it's interesting to think about those comparison points because they were so ubiquitous at the time, and yet thinking back to them, neither of them make sense. I don't think of R.E.M. as a band who are a bit like the Smiths. I certainly don't think of R.E.M. as a band that are a bit like U2. The differences leap out more than the similarities at this
Yeah,
point.
it's weird, and I suppose it's why I'm so nervous about making comparisons between one band and another. It's am I making this comparison
Mm,
because I genuinely think these people sound similar, or am I making it for ease of access for other people that might like this music? You know, for people that like the Smiths, I guess I've no doubt that they'll
mm.
like REM, but how much of that comes down to
Yeah.
just liking good music? Because as
Yeah,
much as there is
essentially, yes. Yeah, if you like things that are
yeah,
good, you'll
exactly.
like
It's like if you
this.
like this, you'll like this. It's like, if you have a slice of red velvet cake, chances are you're gonna like chocolate cake as well. Just because they're the same food group doesn't
Mm.
mean they're the same musical element.
Yeah, yeah, and I think one of the things that sets REM apart very strongly, particularly on this album, is their southernness, which is something that obviously the two sort of the British and Irish bands they were compared to
Yeah.
don't have that. I think that list of genres that you read out from the book, like most accounts of what genre Murmur belongs to, don't actually mention country. And I think that country is a very strong influence, particularly on Stipe's vocals. I would go so far as to say that songs like Sitting Still and Shaking Through qualify as country rock. But country in the early 80s was very walled off from the rest of the American music industry. It wasn't like today where you have artists like Casey Musgraves who are happy to cross over with other genres and styles. Country was just country, and people who liked country liked it, and no
Yeah,
one
it was
else
very
did.
much a Dolly Parton, Willie Nelson, Dwight Yoakam generation of country music.
Yeah, yeah. All of which, by the way,
Lovely
I'm
stuff, yeah.
thoroughly on board with, but I can see why people would not necessarily
Yes.
see that in the first album from this hip new sort of much
I
buzzed
suppose
about
it's because at the
band.
time country was seen as such a dirty word almost. It's kind of like pop now, where
Mm,
you don't really think about
yeah.
the broad range that pop has. The only thing we think of when we think pop is, I suppose, Ed Sheeran, Billie Eilish, Harry Styles, that sort of category. But out of those three, two of them are
Mm,
really strong independent artists that have just been catapulted into the pop genre, not because of their lyrical content, but because of how popular it is. Pop music is popular music.
yeah.
Um, and I don't think many people realize how many artists really do want to be in the pop music genre. They are actively seeking that big hit that elevates them to that next level. So for REM to
Yes.
sort of sway really strongly into those country roots, it doesn't just make sense, but it's actually really quite impressive. It's impressive still that they've managed to smuggle it into this album without anybody noticing. Um, considering
Essentially,
that one of the
yeah, yeah.
subgenres is post punk, I can't think Willie Nelson would do a good job of post punk, but
post-punk is a weird
Yeah.
call for this because I think there's only a couple of songs that really fit that. I would say Radio Free Europe,
Yeah.
you can see a bit of post-punk in, and 9-9 is very
It's not
definitely
exactly like
post-punk,
it's not
but
exactly
that's about
Remain in
it.
Light, is it? It's not exactly Disintegration by The Cure.
No.
It's not like, you know, this is an album that has a song where he just starts screaming Pilgrimage over and over again. It's not exactly, you know, what are they called? You know,
Yeah, it's well, I don't know. I can imagine post-punk
I
artists just
suppose it's
screaming
something. Yeah,
Pilgrimage over and over
Marquee
again, but
Moon.
in a very different context, I
Yeah,
would say.
it's got a very Gang of Four feeling to it. Um,
Yeah, like I can imagine, obviously, R.E.M. later collaborated with Patti Smith. I can imagine her
oh yeah,
screaming Pilgrimage over and over again, but I can't imagine her doing it so weirdly
and I
soothingly.
suppose that kind of actually, I'm glad you brought up that collaboration there with Patti Smith because obviously ever since R.E.M.
Mm,
ended, it's been quite quiet for Michael Stipe. It's not exactly been, you
yeah.
know, a lot of lead singers they'll go off and they'll do some solo work even if you haven't heard of it. You know, Brett Anderson's got 3 albums from his solo career apparently. Michael Stipe, who knew? Roger Daltrey's got like 7. He needs to pack himself in. But Michael Stipe, ever since R.E.M. split up, has done four singles, and one of them was
Mm,
an Earth Day exclusive with Brian Eno, which I haven't listened to. I don't think anybody's listened to because he had to purchase it, and nobody buys music anymore. Um, but
yes,
it's not
yeah.
exactly, you know. I think everybody was expecting him to do more stuff, more albums, more music, and essentially to return to the roots of, you know, that country's association with Murmur. But I remember reading just after. Well, I don't remember reading it in the past. I read it like yesterday when R.E.M. split up. They said they didn't want to do it any sort of reunion on new music because it would feel like cashing in on nostalgia, and that's what I can
Yeah.
always appreciate. I think Murmur is very much not just of its time, but it's not something the band ever really went back so thoroughly to. I don't think they ever picked up those country influences and really associated themselves with it as strongly as Murmur.
That's definitely true, I think. The nearest thing there is to this in their later work is their third album, Fables of the Reconstruction. But even that is kind of, the story of Fables of the Reconstruction is the record company sent them to London to make that album with, I think it was Don Boyd.
It was
Some,
Joe
was
Boyd.
it, was that later?
Joe Boyd.
Joe Boyd, that's it.
Yeah,
Yeah, a big folk rock producer. And they were miserable. They hated every second of it. So it became kind of an exercise in going back to an imagined South and just sort of dreaming the South. Whereas Murmur is the kind of album you make when you're so steeped in southernness that you don't even realise you're being really
absolutely. It's,
southern.
I think, Reckoning. I mean, their second album's such a contrast to that, and it's, you know, they've started to find their
Mm,
placement. They've started to find that genre, and the niche that REM has means that they started caving further away from country. Essentially, you know, you can by the third album, if you're
yeah,
working with the Fairpoint Convention and Nick Drake's producer, I don't think you're going to be able to pull it back to that country instinct because it was very much of the time.
yeah,
It's kind of like, I mean, the best example I can think of because I know so much about them is Pulp when they were sort of chasing the Europop boom, where you've got stuff like Freaks and Separations that
yeah.
sound so, what's the word for it?
There's
Yeah,
a sort of tinny
there's a
oddness to
real
those
ominous
records,
tone
isn't there?
to it
Yes.
underneath it all. It sounds very electronic, not electronic in the sense of electronic music, but actually like
Yeah.
electronically artificial. And it's such a weird soundscape. And
Yeah.
it's amazing to me that REM never went back to that country route because it is such a strong route. But there are little fragments of it. There are little drops of it every now and then. And I suppose,
I think you can always
yeah,
get a seed of it. I always thought if you listen to Mine Smell Like Honey from Collapse Into Now as late as that, Michael Stipe's voice is so southern in that I don't know if he's deliberately doing it, but he's really playing up the southern twang in his
I
voice
think it's
there.
actually him because I remember I watched a couple of Glastonbury clips and he would introduce the songs and I don't remember what he
Mm.
said. It was as nonsensical as the stuff on Murmur, but it was such with a country twang, and I suppose it steps out because it's obviously in
Yeah.
Glastonbury. But even on stuff like "It's the End of the World as We Know It," which I think that was actually the first R.E.M song I ever heard. Even something
Oh,
like
lovely.
that,
Yeah.
obviously because it's got such a fast pace to it, you can hear it. You can hear it in the hooks. You can hear it in the.
That's
That's
great.
exactly it. You can hear it in the little
Yeah.
verb associations. You can hear it when he pronounces a name, just in little charms like that. And it's just for a moment you think, hang on a second, is he going to Johnny Cash this? And then he just moves on. And I suppose that's
Yeah.
a great example though, because 1983, the start of country for R.E.M. is quite an odd choice because artists that were making particularly country oriented music were at their wits' end. Johnny Cash was stuck in a record deal that he couldn't get out of. Bob Dylan had just
Mm.
released, I think he was gearing up to do Empire Burlesque, which was the start of his, I'm going to try and capture 80s funk in an album for several years. It was after Mark
Oh,
Knopfler decided that's a bit much
yeah.
for me, Bob. So kind of went the way of the wind. So really, again, it's country was a dirty word at the time, particularly for a band that was brand new trying to make their mark in music. Um,
Are you aware, by the way, of who nearly produced this album? Because your mention of Empire
I'm
Burlesque
not,
just
and I'm
brought this to
scared
mind,
now.
and it's an amazing story. It was nearly going to be Stephen Hague, who would, of course,
Yeah,
go on to make incredible music with
that's
New Order, but is like the antithesis of
yeah.
what R.E.M needed at this point. And there's a famous story about him spending a whole day getting Bill Berry just to play the drums to Catapult over and over again. And when they came back in the next morning, they found you couldn't even hear Bill on the recording. He'd overlaid it with synth drums, and they just said, lock this in a
Yeah.
very deep, dark vault. We never want anyone
I
to
was just
hear
about to
this
joke. I
thing.
bet he replaced him with a drum machine. And as it turned out, that's what he did. Of
Yes, he
course he did.
did.
It's Stephen Hague. What am I meant to expect? Uh, I mean, I guess the trajectory of Hague from that point would have been very different because I don't think it would have worked with Pet Shop Boys had he produced an almost country album with a newly founded band. Um,
Oh, I don't think it would have been an almost country album if they'd kept Hague
he
on
would
to
have
do
made a
it.
different form of New Order with R.E.M. I have no doubt about that. It's
Yeah,
such a
yeah.
strange one. But I suppose on the offset of that, we do at least have a good album with us. Which
Completely, yeah. And they to their credit, IRS compromised with this. They said they could work with Mitch Easter, who'd produced all of their early demos, but they couldn't do it in the weird old tumble down 8-track studio where they enjoyed working. They had to go to a proper studio which was soundproofed and everything. So, you give a little,
and
you
I
take a
suppose that's the
little.
beauty of Murmur. It's there's influences from a lot of the genres that aren't associated with the album. You know, you've got a bit of Dylan, you've got a bit of the Who even, and it
Mm,
all just sort of climbs together, and it's quite lovely.
mm,
And I suppose that does enable Murmur quite a lot, especially when its legacy is concerned. Because like we said at the start, it's 39 years since Murmur released, and the book dared the question: would we remember this
yeah.
album in 20 to 30 years' time? And I suppose we do, for a number of reasons.
Oh yeah, it's the greatest thing to come out of 1983 up to and
See,
including
that's the
me.
thing. I'm going to try and do some quick maths here, and I won't edit it because I can't use iMovie that well.
Mm.
So, hang on. I'm telling you, I'm just going to Google it because 1999, this released 16 years before I was born. Because I'm, as much as I like to
Right.
joke that I'm old, but at the time I record, I'm only 22. I'll be 23 on Christmas Day. That's terrifying.
Oh, you were born on
I,
Christmas Day,
I
like the
was. I'm
Saint
the second
Etienne
thing to
song.
come out of that day. The first being the Saint Etienne song. The third, I think, is Isaac Newton. Um, but for me, I think a lot of the legacy comes down to the contrast essentially that Murmur creates. Again, it links back to that jangle pop theory of, oh well,
Mm.
if it's jangle pop, it must be the Smiths. Where's Morrissey? Um, it's such a stark
Yeah,
contrast to what the Smiths were doing at the time. I suppose '83 would have been maybe should have
that would
been,
have been the
yeah.
first Smiths album,
It
right?
seems like
Wouldn't
it.
it? Yeah, which is an album that is accidentally as murky and incoherent as this is
Yeah,
deliberately
because
murky and
yeah, so it would have
incoherent.
been a couple of months after the release of this, and then obviously they did Muse Murder, and So I suppose R.E.M. had their foot
Mm.
in the door of Jangle Pop before the Smiths really released an album, but at the time I think it was a bigger boom in the UK than it was in the US because the UK had nothing really going for it. It was either that or keep listening to Public Image Limited. So it was one or the other. And
Mm.
I think what happens with Murmur is it's a rare occasion of an artist immediately knowing what they wanted their sound to be. They know what they want to do and they continued to do it for much of their career. There were obviously avenues of success that
Yeah.
followed that were not particularly as rooted as Murmur. I suppose Everybody Hurts is such a, especially now, it feels like such a commercial song because of how much it's played and how much people are aware of it. But even then, it doesn't. Yeah,
And also, I mean, for Michael Stipe,
yeah,
that was a deliberate experiment in writing something more direct. He was genuinely troubled by what the teenage
yeah,
suicide rate in America was at that time, and he wanted to write something that would offer solace without forcing you to go through
yes.
various obscure
I suppose it reminds me
metaphors
quite
to
a lot
get
of what
there.
Nick Cave does now, and I only say that because I've been reading Faith, Hope, and Carnage, which I've taken the slipcover off because it kept falling onto me, and he said something
Oh
along the
yeah,
lines of um, seeing an image for the song and then writing the lyrics associated with an image. So he would actually have a dream essentially, wake up and think, "Oh, that's quite a good song angle," and then he would write the lyrics, and then the message of the lyrics would come later. And I get that feeling with Michael Stipe quite a lot of the time, where it's he has no idea what he's writing. He's gone mad. Somebody has locked him in a room with 3 biros and no paper, and he's gone right. Well, better commit these to memory. And what happens is such a strange innovation. It's lyrics that have such deep meaning and movement to them because he controls the tempo with his lyrics. He controls where the song goes with lyrics that might not even make sense. And I can see that being such a turn off for a lot of listeners. I can think of my mate who doesn't really like R.E.M. He can listen to A Losing My Religion at a push.
mm,
Any of their earlier stuff, he's like, it's nonsense. It's like,
yeah.
it is. That's the beauty of it. It's such nonsensical stuff.
But
Yeah,
it's very image led, isn't it? Which I think saves it from being pure nonsense. That when you look at songs like Perfect Circle or Catapult, these are songs about childhood, but they don't start off by saying, "Well, it was the summer of '68. You know, I just moved to a new town with my family." They're just little images of like playing sport with friends, of seeing the porch light
yeah.
on, little tiny things
And I
that are
think it's that
evocative of childhood.
specification that really helps. Firstly, I must say, don't slander Brian Adams. He released the
Mm.
worst album of this year. He has some merit to him. He did. It's called So
Did
Happy It
he? I
Hurts,
didn't
and
know
I
that. I
went
didn't
to
know he was still
the.
going.
I was sent off to review part of the tour, um, and I left halfway through because I wanted to get the train
Right.
home. I heard Summer of '69. That's all really people go for. To be fair, he can still sing. I'm not convinced, and I
Yeah.
suppose it's why I like REM as as an image. It's a group with an image that goes beyond. Oh, we wear black jumpers and skinny jeans now, because a lot of '80s bands do that now. Where, especially like Brian
Yeah.
Adams, Suede, their image has now become, we know our age and we're going to just dress appropriately, and
Yes. This is
it's the Ricky
slimming.
Gervais of music.
Slimming
It's black is
colours.
slimming. Why do you think? Why do you think I wear this black coat? It's
Wh- when we're talking about image, actually, we
yes,
should bring up
yeah,
the packaging of this album because I think it's a beautifully packaged record. And part of that image is they were very
yeah.
reluctant to have band photographs on. They lost that fight, but the band photographs in the inlay sleeve to Murmur are like, you know, passport photos taken at the bottom of a well.
it's
Um, the the bulk of the packaging is taken up with these very evocative and again very southern pictures of things that are quite gothic and mysterious. The cover is, it's a real thing apparently. They have these vines called kudzu vines, which were imported over from Japan at first as part of little ornamental gardens that they used to grow on plantations, and it's turned out to be an invasive species. It's like took over most of Georgia now, but that's why you have these extraordinary sort of this front cover where you can't even tell what you're looking at. What is the
It
shape
looks,
under those plants? But
yeah,
it's
it
very
looks far more.
dreamlike.
I mean, it's really difficult to explain because that is an image that looks like a bit of a forest, and this is really helpful for those that can't see it. They
Mm.
can Google it. Google just perfect. There
Hang
we
on. If
go.
you're
Oh, you've
watching
got the
this on
CD.
video,
Perfect. I was going to get the
there it is.
vinyl, but I just got Sam Fender's first vinyl because
Yeah,
I saw it was back in stock. I was like, I've got to get that. Threw it in the cart and away it went. I've also ordered a pair of
yeah.
shoes because once a year I buy one pair of shoes, so I've hit my quota. So last year I got a pair of Jordans. This year I've gone for a pair of Doc Martens. So we'll see how that goes because the last time I got boots, they started
Nice.
cutting the back of my heels and I just went shoeless for a year. Just didn't leave the house. It was lucky that it was COVID though, to be fair, so I didn't actually have to go anywhere. Um, as far as the imagery
True.
associated
Yeah,
with Murmur, I'm
yeah.
really glad you brought that up because it's something that the band have managed to avoid for some time. Is that putting themselves on the cover was not their intention, and I think bands that do put themselves on the
Yeah.
cover are such ego jumpers. I don't think there's any good album that has a band on the front. Maybe Different Class, but that's cardboard cutouts. Um,
It feels less. It feels like it's less of an orthodoxy now. I can't remember the last time I saw an album that had like a really clear band photo. But you look back at the early 80s,
yeah.
and it seemed like that was just the done thing. There were all those horrible
Oh,
late period George Harrison covers, and
if
I
you
love George
slander
Harrison.
Cloud
He's my
Nine.
favourite Beatle, but I'm gonna slander Cloud9 because that's exactly what I was
It's
thinking of.
brilliant.
It's awful. He's got that big grin on his face, and you're like, I'm glad you're having fun here, George, because
That big grin from
honestly,
George
I'm
Harrison,
not.
and then it's the big shades that wrap around like Tron, and he's just smiling, and you can see
Yeah,
behind those shades there's a little wink that goes, "You're gonna buy this, aren't you?" And that's it. I think
yeah. I could put out a record with this cover,
the
and
worst
you're
one is
still
Ringo with
going
the
to buy
rose,
it.
where he's sort of got it pushed up to his face, and it's like, what was he thinking? Like every Ringo album has him on the front, and I suppose that's to remind people he was in the Beatles. But
It's like Ringo Starr's version of. Have you ever seen the video
I've
to
not.
Major
But
Leagues by Pavement, where they were asked to do something more commercial that would like something that would I don't know if they said something that would like make Stephen Malkmus a heartthrob, but he is just sort of simpering and holding flowers up to his face
I
throughout the
cannot
whole
think of
video.
one
It's
music video
incredible.
where the band have positively spoken about their experience afterwards. Every sort of reunion or every sort of interview that follows 10 years on from a music video releasing, the band have gone, that was a real struggle to record. It was really tiring. It was really awful. I just spoke to Simon Rich from
Mm.
Kaiser Chiefs who said I can't remember what song it was. It might have been the one about the angry mob. um, he said that when they did the music video
Oh
for that,
yeah,
they'd
yeah.
been flown over immediately after finishing a set in Denmark, didn't have a hotel to sleep in, were essentially streamlined straight to it, had to wait and sleep in Heathrow Airport, and then got to the recording. And then as soon as that was done, it was like, you've got no hours of sleeping yet. The last thing you want to be doing is stood around 50 extras who want your autograph, strumming a guitar, really. And
Yes.
I suppose one of the things with R.E.M. especially is that
I can.
a lot of their music videos, and I don't mean to drift off topic on Murmur because it's a very visual album, but a lot of their music videos are quite unique. There is real abstract dedication to them, apart from Shiny
Abstract.
Happy People, which is just fucking
Yeah.
hilarious, brilliant. It's just Michael Stipe dancing with a group of people.
But it's true, and I think I can think of solo artists who seem to enjoy the video making process. But I think when you're talking about bands, if you have like
Yeah,
joined a band to play the drums, you probably don't want to be a film star. It's not among your interests, and certainly there was a massive schism in R.E.M. where Michael Stipe was very interested in the idea of how can you make videos that aren't just MTV fodder? Because
yeah,
this is around the time that MTV had first launched. There was definitely a very set way of making videos, which you can see encapsulated in those early Duran Duran videos, where
yeah.
everything is about flash and wow. Everything is about impressing you with how expensive this looks. So that doesn't offer many opportunities to make a visual, like a
Yeah.
visual accompaniment to an album like Murmur. And Stipe was very interested in cracking that nut. And the rest of the band, particularly Peter Buck, could not care less. There is an early R.E.M video compilation, I think it was released tie-in with Document, where Peter and I think Mike do an introduction in the character of time travelers from the future, trying to work out why humanity briefly thought music videos were a good idea.
I
And
think
that
it
was
still
the
is the attitude
attitude,
as well. As
really.
I've never thought, oh wow, I can't wait for a music video to drop. And it's the best example I can think of is Dave Rowntree of all
Mm,
people is releasing a new album, and his music video is just him sat on a train with a
yeah,
camera pointing, and he's looking out the window for 3.5 minutes. That's it, and it's such a shoehorned cash in of a music video. I just can't help but respect it because music
yeah.
is obviously a very audible experience, and I suppose sorry, there's a helicopter flying overhead. I don't know if they can hear that.
I did wonder about that. It sounded like some weird belching
It's weird
dragon
because I don't live
noise,
near a
which is quite
helipad or anything.
exciting.
Uh, the one on my roof is out of commission. It's
You do now.
it's to
It's
be fair,
just
they used to
touched
fly over the
down on
field
the
there,
roof.
but they're building a house there now, so they can't land. Um, that's really thrown me. I've forgotten what I was on about. Yeah, Dave Rowntree. Um, and again, like you said, the MTV era was just
Yes.
coming through. Oh my god, that's a huge helicopter. For the people listening on Spotify, this is terrible, but for me, it's fantastic. Yeah, so like 1986, Beastie Boys sort of broke through with the MTV angle, um, and they managed it. Yeah,
Yeah. And they
I
managed
think
to do
that's
something really creative
it's
and
because
individual
one, they
within
knew their
those
market, and
strictures.
two, they had no choice. That was
Mm.
by the end of that first
Yeah.
album, they had to do that. They had to do something visual, and I think now it's
Yeah.
sort of capsized. There's no need for music videos anymore because who really? I can't think of many people that actually tune into the TV to listen to the charts anymore because it's now immediately available on Spotify and stuff. I'm not going to go on at MTV and sit around waiting for Yardax the Overload to pop up because I know it's not going to happen. It's
Well, it's this weird stratified thing now, isn't it? Where if you're a big pop artist, if you're someone like, Beyonce,
yeah,
you're expected to do a video for every single song, whether it's a single or not. And if you're anything
yeah,
below that
exactly. And
level, no one
I
actually
suppose
cares.
Beyonce's sort of made the next step towards what big artists are going to be doing, which is by essentially making films, which is really impressive. The only
Yeah,
other one I can think of really is Childish Gambino, but mainly because of how it was assimilated into culture as a meme,
yeah,
rather than
yeah,
anything it actually did. Um, but for REM, no, I think the videos are often as confused and unspecific as the lyrics Stipe portrays, and it's beautiful. But I suppose we've got to pick a best track for the album,
yes.
haven't we? We've got to narrow it down to just one, which is difficult because this is an album that is
Um,
filled with really strong tracks and it shows a great variety. Like the best of singles, the best of first albums should always give a good range of what we can
yeah.
expect from an artist at this point in their career. The early birds that are getting in early and thinking, well, what's this all about? REM has such a broad range here that it's really difficult to pick one. Um,
Yeah, and there are songs that I think are superb, but so uncharacteristic that I would quaver to name it as my pick of the album that you can look through and very easily say, West of the
yeah,
Fields is a bit too like punky and dynamic. Perfect Circle is a bit too minimal. We
it is
Walk is a
very
bit too
good.
cute. Although I do love We Walk, as silly as it is. Yeah, I think I would have to go with Laughing because I can't pick out another song that encapsulates what I find so fascinating about this idea, this era of REM, where you have that driving bass line that opens it, and you think, "Oh wow, this is going to be a rocker," and then when it comes in, it's much more delicate and pretty than that, but there's still something so fraught about it. Again, the way you keep getting these fragments, the way Stipe keeps repeating the phrase "in a room," and you think, well, what room? Why are you so concerned about it? Like, most things happen in a room, but the way he keeps lingering on it makes you suspect the worst here. The odd mythological associations with it, the mention of Lacuan, which I think he'd seen like a sculpture of. It's one of those sort of posy things that happens in the south where they have like ancient Greek and ancient Roman styled architecture around places. It seems to sum up everything that's beautiful and
It's
puzzling
yeah,
about
I'd
the
agree
whole
with you. I
record
mean, for
to
my
me.
notes, I've just put laughing or pilgrimage for sure. That's all I wrote. Didn't no expansion on as to why that would be.
Mm.
Um, really did myself dirty in having to explain my choices, but there we go. Laughing or pilgrimage for sure. Um, I think pilgrimage
Yes.
because I like how intense it is when it really has
Mm.
no right to be. Because a man shouting the word pilgrimage over and over again in the wrong hands is actual loony bin asylum treatment stuff. With Michael Stipe, it just seems really profound. Um,
Yes.
and that's a commitment and a dedication and sort of a
Yeah, yeah.
forthright confidence that a lot of artists don't have. And Murmur for me is best explained with that forthright confidence that's found on Pilgrimage. It's a very assured album. It's a very confident album, despite not knowing one what it means or two where it's going. And I think there's such dedication from Stipe and the band to just explore that, to just keep going. And for me, Pilgrimage is sort of the explosion of that. Um,
When you get into that middle eight in Pilgrimage, where it's got the staccato bit,
yes,
ding, 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 Pilgrimage. It's that's so wonderful because you feel like you've sleepwalked into it. You know, the rest of the track is so quiet and dreamy, and that comes not as an interruption. It doesn't startle you. You catch yourself listening to it, and you think, how did the song get here? I don't understand, which
yeah,
is a
I
great
think the first time I
strength of
listened to it, I thought,
Murmur,
have
I
I missed
think.
something here? And I just rewind it about 30 seconds. Like, no, that's such a clear,
Yeah.
gradual progression into something that just changes the song entirely. And
Mm,
I had that with Charlotte DeSantos, which is why I recommended them at the start of the episode. Is her her music, even a 2.5 minute
I must
track,
catch some of
could
that.
go from
Yeah.
a real slow burn to this explosion. And there's one song on a new album, and I think it's the first song that I can't remember the name of, but it starts with lyrics and a bass line, and that bass line starts getting really funky almost. It starts to get really aggressive, and then you slowly start hearing other instruments pile into it, and it's just such an impressive technical layer. And I think that's what I love about
Mm.
R.E.M, and it's why I do think, obviously, I don't think there'll be a replacement album for this one. I think that's very core to the 2001. Um, but for me, it's the technical experimentation that's on display, the layered effect, the actual gradual appeal of R.E.M was that they could layer instruments really, really well and have it be such an impressive soundscape
Mm.
to essentially profit and project Michael Stipe's lyrics, which a lot of the time were just who knows what they meant.
Yes. Yeah,
But
absolutely.
no,
Yeah.
any replacement from you? You don't want to stick Cloud9 on there instead?
No, I was thinking about something you said on the Abbey Road podcast, which was like, is there another album by the same artist that you would put in place of this? Which with the Beatles is
Yeah,
obviously, you're spoiled for choice. With R.E.M, I think although this is definitely one of my favourite R.E.M albums, I have to give a shout out to Monster, which I think was badly misunderstood at the time, but gets more and more
yeah,
extraordinary as the years go by. I think, like Murmur, Monster is an album that doesn't sound like anything else. And unlike Murmur, it's an album that is obviously within certain trends of its time. And a lot of people, when it came out, said, "Oh, it's R.E.M trying to do grunge and they're getting it wrong." And I think, well, Yeah, but if they could perfectly replicate what Nevermind sounded like,
Ooh, yeah.
this album would be a hell of a lot less interesting. The fact that Monster is kind of like fussy grunge, it's kind of like paranoid grunge, rather than it being this big, messy, sprawling, bluesy thing. It's very disciplined, it's very post-punk, everything sounds very precise and fraught. It's very 90s in that it has this big brash surface, but underneath there is something really paranoid and
Yeah,
uncomfortable and
it's even
uncertain
a little
about
bit
it, and I love
psychedelic at
that.
times, where it's sort of remnants of songs from the 13th Floor sort of echo through, and
Mm.
it's delightful. I'm not actually sure if Monster's on the list already, but I will double check, and then if it is, I don't. I mean, there's nothing I can do about it. It's not my list, but it will be soon.
Yeah. If it is, I'd like to give a shout out to Reveal, which I think is like, I don't know how it lands for other people, but Reveal is the R.E.M album that came out in the summer I turned
Yeah, is that the
18,
one with
so to me,
Beach
it's
Ball at the end?
perfect.
Yeah,
Yes, that's the
yeah.
one.
It's a
Yeah,
lot
a
of
gorgeous
REM
summer record.
albums, particularly for me, are sort of the ones that I associate with where I am at the time. So I suppose, I mean, Automatic for the People was, as
Yeah,
popular a
same.
choice as it is, was absolutely my favourite REM record. But I think Murmur has kind of peaked above that. They
They
do, they
play
do.
off each other surprisingly well, don't they? Considering that one was an international mega hit and the other was like recorded in a barn by a band no one had ever heard of at that point. But
Yeah.
they do
Oh,
feel like
definitely.
they could be
It's
sibling
it.
albums in a lot of
I
ways.
hate how depthful REM are because there's a lot of albums that make the argument for going on this list, but I think they've only got like 3 on there, which is at the same time as being
Yeah.
fairly generous for this list is also criminally too little. But
Yeah, but it makes that deep dive that I talked about. This was the perfect band to go on
yeah,
like a first deep dive with. It couldn't be bettered because there's some records that everyone knows, but even when you get into the deep cuts, they are always unique and interesting. Like I'm perfectly capable of going on a deep dive with Bowie. I have done more than once, but you are aware that there are certain stretches of his career where you're not in for a fun time. Whereas with R.E.M., even the ones that I don't think quite land, and there are a couple of those,
yeah, oh,
I
definitely. I
feel
mean, for me, it
glad
was
to have
REM, then
gotten
I did
through.
Bowie, and then I did Elvis Costello, which are artists with enough range and enough albums to warrant an actual deep
Mm,
dive that takes weeks, and they're all a lot of fun. And it's like you said, regardless of the
yes,
quality or lack of it on an REM album, there is always something in there that's quite fun. There's always either a big single or a surprising album piece that makes you pause for
yeah.
thought and go, well, that's actually quite inspired. Um, but yeah, no, I think Murmur deserves its spot on the list. I think we've confirmed it. We've got another one nailed down. Fantastic. Only over 1,000 more to go. Um,
Ticked off.
but if you'd
Yeah.
like to hear more about me doing this mad project that will probably kill me off, you can follow me on Twitter at Ewan Gleadow, EWANGLEADOW. You can also follow Don't Listen to This Podcast on Twitter as well, DLTT Pod. You can get my work on Daily Star, Cult Following, Northern Lights. Not Northern Lights, I haven't worked there for years. It's a dead website, don't go there. I don't say that as if to like slander the people that did it. I was the one that ran it. It's not. It doesn't function anymore. Um, Daily Star, Cult Following, Geek Show Clapper, Newcastle World. Um, Probably a couple others, but you can just follow me on Twitter and I'll retweet it at everybody, which is how much of my career has been so far. But no, I think Murmur captures the well-tailored careers of good art. Um, I have no idea what the next episode is. Probably Wings. Bye.